And now we leave the book of Genesis behind, which records the story of all of those people that we have looked at up through verse 22. And we come into the book of Exodus, and the book of Exodus tells us the story of Moses.
Start off just reading the book of Exodus without having read or studied the book of Genesis. I think you're going to find yourself a little lost without the background that the book of Genesis gives.
And here we look at the second phase in this sort of four-part transition in Moses' life. This transition from being this sort of prince in Egypt to being a leader of the Exodus. This transition that takes a number of years and that takes a rather winding road.
We think often of Moses as being an old man with a beard, but it was in his youth that he made the decisions that brought him to greatness. Because the scripture says by faith Moses, when he'd come to years, maybe 17 or 18 years of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter.
Ellicott's commentary for English readers, which is the announcement of the 10th plague. Verse 1, and the Lord said, meaning rather, now the Lord had said. The passage is parenthetic and refers to a revelation made to Moses before his present interview with Pharaoh began. The insertion is needed in order to explain the confidence of Moses in regard to the last plague. Exodus chapter 11 verse 5, and the effect it would have on the Egyptians. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. The word rendered altogether belongs to the first clause. Translate, when he shall let you go altogether, he shall assuredly thrust you out hence. Exodus chapter 11 begins with God telling Moses about the final and most devastating plague that will befall Egypt. The final plague will kill every firstborn of humans and animals in Egypt, including the firstborn of Pharaoh and the firstborn of servants. And we see several things unfold, including the Israelites will ask the Egyptians for silver and gold before leaving. The Egyptians will grant the Israelites' requests, and the Egyptians will beg the Israelites to leave after the plague. Maclaren's Expositions explains the following events. As a last merciful warning, the first point to be noted in this passage is that it interposes a solemn pause between the preceding ineffectual plagues and the last effectual one. There is an awful lull in the storm before the last crashing hurricane which lays every obstacle flat. There is silence in heaven before the final peal of thunder. Verse 2 is a reminder of different lessons, including God's love and power. We see God's love on display for the Israelites through His provision for their physical needs and restoration of their dignity after slavery, and God's power and authority over the Egyptian gods. And Pharaoh is shown through the reversal of the Israelite status. Verse 2 is a directive that comes from God's broader plan to prepare His people for their departure from Egypt. God's love and power clearly illustrates divine favor during a time of judgment. It also shows how God can grant favor and respect in unexpected places. From Ellicott's commentary for English readers, the Lord gave the people favor, or when the time arrived. The man Moses. At first sight, there seems a difficulty in supposing Moses to have written thus of himself. The man is not a title by which writers of any time or country are in the habit of speaking of themselves. But it is far more difficult to imagine anyone but Moses giving him so bald and poor a designation. To other writers he is a prophet very great. It has been said that this expression does not comport well with the meekness of Moses. But it is the mere statement of a fact, and of one necessary to be stated for the proper understanding of the narrative. Moses, in the course of his long contention as an equal with Pharaoh, had come to be regarded not only by the courtiers, but by the Egyptians generally, as a great personage, almost on a par with the Pharaoh, whom they revered as a god upon earth. The position to which he had thus attained exerted an important influence on the entire Egyptian people at this time, causing them to be well inclined towards his countrymen, and willing to make sacrifices in order to help them and obtain their goodwill. From Benson Commentary of Exodus chapter 11 verse 3, the man Moses was very great. The Egyptians all held him in great esteem and veneration, as a person that had an extraordinary power with God. This seems to be mentioned as the reason why Pharaoh did not attempt anything against his person, and also why he and the Israelites found so much favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Matthew Henry's Concise Commentary chapter 11 verses 1, 2, and 3, a secret revelation was made to Moses while in the presence of Pharaoh, that he might give warning of the last dreadful judgment before he went out. This was the last day of the servitude of Israel. They were about to go away. Their masters, who had abused them in their work, would have sent them away empty. But God provided that the laborers should not lose their hire, and ordered them to demand it now at their departure, and it was given to them. God will right the injured, who in humble silence commit their cause to him. And none are losers at last by patient suffering. The Lord gave them favor in the sight of the Egyptians, by making it appear how much he favored them. He also changed the spirit of the Egyptians toward them, and made them to be pitied of their oppressors. Those that honor God, he will honor. Barnes' Notes on the Bible explains of every man. From Exodus chapter 3 verse 22, only women were named. The command is more explicit when the time has come for its execution. Therefore they complied with their request, not only out of love to the people, but out of fear to Moses, lest he should punish them severely in case of refusal. Gill's exposition of the entire Bible. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they freely and willingly lent them the things they asked of them, which seems to be said, by way of anticipation, for this was not done until the following plague was inflicted. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt. His name was famous throughout the whole land, because of the signs and wonders and miracles wrought by him. They took him to be a very extraordinary person, as he was, and had him in great esteem, because at his entreaty the plagues were removed from them, when they had been wrought on them. And this made them the more willing to lend the above things to the people of Israel when they asked them of them, because of their great respect to Moses, and whom, if they did not cordially love, yet they feared, and might imagine that if they did not comply with the request of his people, he might resent it, and employ his power against them. And thus he stood either beloved or feared, or both, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, his ministers, courtiers, and counselors, and in the sight of the people, the common people, the inhabitants of the land of Egypt. Geneva Study Bible explains, and the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. Exegetically Pulpit Commentary on verse 3, and the Lord gave the people favor when the time came. Moreover, the man Moses, etc. It has been supposed that this is an interpolation, and argued that Moses, being so meek as he was, would not have spoken of himself in the terms here used. But very great here only means very influential, and the fact is stated not to glorify Moses, but to account for the ornaments being so generally given. Moreover, it is highly improbable that any other writer than himself would have so baldly and bluntly designated Moses as the man Moses. The greatness which Moses had now attained was due to the powers which he had shown. First of all, he had confounded the magicians. Exodus chapter 8 verse 18. Then he had so far impressed the courtiers that a number of them took advantage of one of his warnings, and thereby saved their cattle and slaves. Exodus chapter 9 verse 20. Finally, he had forced the entire court to acknowledge that it lay in his power to destroy or save Egypt. Exodus chapter 10 verse 7. He had after that parleyed with the king very much as an equal. It is no wonder that the Egyptians, who regarded their king as a great god, were deeply impressed. And Moses said, in continuation of the speech recorded in Exodus chapter 10, verse 29. Face to face with Pharaoh, Moses makes his last appeal, utters his last threats. The Pharaoh has bidden him see his face no more, and he has accepted the warning, and declared, I will see thy face again no more. It is the last interview, the last interchange of speech. Moses had to deliver himself of a message. Hardened as his heart is, Pharaoh is yet to be allowed a place for repentance. God announces to him, by the mouth of Moses, the coming destruction of the firstborn, emphasizes the terrible nature of the impending calamity by the announcement that through all Egypt there would be a great cry. Contrasts with their despair the absolute immunity of the Israelites, and finally warns the Pharaoh that he and his people will shortly urge the departure which they now refuse to permit. If Pharaoh had even now relented, it was not too late. The great blows might have been escaped: the death of the firstborn and the destruction of the armed force in the Red Sea. But he had hardened himself, and then been hardened, until, practically, the time for relenting was gone by. About midnight. The particular night was not specified, and the torment of suspense was thus added to the pain of an unintermittent fear. But the dreadful visitation was to come at the dreadest hour of the 24 midnight. Thus much was placed beyond doubt. The Bible says, website writes, in this crucial chapter, the narrative highlights the favor that Moses and the Israelites garnered from God, leading to their elevated status among the Egyptians. Ultimately, verse 4 witnessed Moses delivering a final message from God to Pharaoh and the people of Egypt: God will kill every firstborn in Egypt at midnight. This plague was the last and most devastating of the plagues to be inflicted on Egypt. Further, the word I is emphatic in Hebrew, stating that the Lord himself would be going out to inflict this plague. There was nothing that anyone could do to stop it. Verse 5 describes the final plague that God would bring upon Egypt, killing the firstborn of every household, including Pharaoh, his servants, and the cattle. The verse foreshadows the Exodus and the Passover, a key event in Israelite history. Ellicott's commentary for English readers writes, all the firstborn shall die. The Hebrew word translated firstborn is applied only to males, and thus the announcement was that in every family the eldest son should be cut off. In Egypt, as in most other countries, the law of primogeniture prevailed. The eldest son was the hope, stay, and support of the household, his father's companion, his mother's joy, the object of his brothers' and sisters' reverence. The firstborn of the Pharaoh bore the title of Erpa Sudnese, or hereditary crown prince, and succeeded his father, unless he died or was formally set aside during his father's lifetime. Among the nobles, estates were inherited, and sometimes titles descended to the firstborn. No greater affliction can be conceived, short of the general destruction of the people, than the sudden death in every family of him round whom the highest interests and fondest hopes clustered. The maidservant that is behind a mill marks the lowest grade in the social scale, as the king that sits upon his throne marks the highest. All alike were to suffer. In every family there was to be one dead, all the firstborn of beasts. The aggravation of the calamity by its extension to beasts is very remarkable, and is probably to be connected with the Egyptian animal worship. At all times there were in Egypt 4 animals regarded as actual incarnations of deity, and the objects of profound veneration. 3 of these were bulls, while 1 was a white cow. It is not unlikely that all were required to be firstborns, in which case the whole of Egypt would have been plunged into a religious mourning on account of their deaths, in addition to the domestic mourning that must have prevailed in each house. The deaths of other sacred animals, and of many pet animals in houses, would have increased the general consternation. Benson Commentary on Exodus chapter 11 verse 5, the death of the firstborn had been threatened in Exodus chapter 4 verse 23, but is last executed, unless judgments are tried which, if they had done the work, would have prevented this. See how slow God is to wrath, and how willing to be met in the way of his judgments, and to have his anger turned away, that sitteth upon his throne, the maidservant behind the mill, the poor captive slave, employed in the hardest labor. It was the custom then, as it is with the Arabs at present, to grind their corn with hand mills, turned by their women servants, who, for that purpose, stood behind the mill. This is the anticipation of the final plague that God would unleash upon Egypt, targeting the firstborn of every household, from Pharaoh to the lowest servant. Verse 6 is the aftermath of the final plague that God would bring upon Egypt, the death of the firstborn. God warns Pharaoh that at midnight he will pass over Egypt and kill the firstborn of all humans and animals, except for the Israelite children. This plague was the most devastating of all the plagues. The verse describes the loud wailing that would take place throughout Egypt, worse than ever before. But think about what this meant, the significance of what was to come. The firstborn were held in high regard in Egyptian society, and were expected to ascend to the throne and continue the dynasty. This verse, verse 6, captures the impending devastation and terror that would befall the land of Egypt as a result of God's judgment. It serves as a poignant reminder of the consequences of disobedience and the sovereignty of God over all creation. Daniel Coulter of Medium 2024 writes of the final plague. The final plague is the most severe and devastating of all the plagues, as it strikes at the heart of every family and every creature in Egypt. It is also the most symbolic and ironic of all the plagues, as it reveals the contrast between God and the gods of Egypt, between Israel and Egypt, and between life and death, and shows the supremacy of God over the gods of Egypt. The firstborn was considered sacred and special in the ancient Near East, as it represented the strength, the future, and the inheritance of the family and the nation. The firstborn also belonged to the gods, and had to be dedicated or sacrificed to them. By killing the firstborn of Egypt, God demonstrates that he is the true and living God, who has the authority and the power over life and death, and who can judge and destroy the false and powerless gods of Egypt. In fact, some of the Egyptian gods were associated with the firstborn, such as Osiris, the god of the underworld and the judge of the dead, who was the firstborn of the sky god Geb, and the earth goddess Nut Horus, the god of the sky, and the kingship, who was the firstborn son of Osiris and Isis, and Anubis, the god of mummification, and the guardian of the dead, who was the firstborn son of Osiris and Nephthys. By killing the firstborn of Pharaoh, who was considered the son of the sun god Ra, and the incarnation of Horus, God also shows that he is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, who can overthrow and humiliate the proud and rebellious rulers of the earth. Verse 7 conveys that God will protect the Israelites from harm during the final plague in Egypt, while the Egyptians will be consumed by chaos and mourning. The verse states, "Not a dog will bark at any of the sons of Israel." This phrase symbolizes the Israelites' complete safety and peace, and the lack of danger they will face from any source. This should serve as a reminder for all Christians of God's protection and care for His people. Ellicott's commentary for English readers of verse 7, the expression is evidently proverbial. Benson commentary of verse 7, "Shall not a dog move his tongue," explains a proverbial expression, importing all should be peace and quietness among the Israelites, far from any frightful outcry, that in that memorable night they should meet with nothing to molest or disturb them. Verse 8 sees Moses leaving Pharaoh in anger, which highlights the seriousness of the moment. This demonstrates that ignoring divine warnings can have dire consequences. And we eventually see this with Pharaoh's servants, as the Pharaoh's defiance leads to his servants' desperate pleas for submission. Exodus chapter 11 verse 8 is a reminder of divine judgment and the hope that comes from accepting God's will, and provides a glimpse into Moses' inner experience and feelings. Gill's exposition of the entire Bible, and Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, which are related in the preceding chapters. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, one time after another, and yet more, and more, so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of his land until the last plague, the slaying of the firstborn, was brought upon him and his people, related in the following chapter. Geneva Study Bible explains, "And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of his land." Ellicott's commentary for English readers, verse 8, "All these thy servants," i.e., the high officers of the court who were standing about Pharaoh. These grandees would come to Moses when the blow fell, and prostrate themselves before him as if he were their king, and beseech him to take his departure with all his nation. The details are given more fully and more graphically in this place than in the subsequent narrative. In a great anger, Hebrew, in heat of anger, i.e., burning with indignation. Moses had not shown this in his speech, which had been calm and dignified, but he here records what he had felt. For once his acquired meekness failed, and the hot natural temper of his youth blazed up. His life had been threatened, or he had been ignominiously dismissed. He had been deprived of his right of audience for the future. Exodus chapter 10 verse 28. Under such circumstances, he did well to be angry. Verses 9 and 10, "And the Lord said," the series of the 9 wonders wrought by Moses and Aaron is terminated by this short summary, of which the main points are, first, God had said that the miracles would fail to move Pharaoh's second. He had assigned as the reason for this failure his own will that the wonders should be multiplied. Third, the miracles had now been wrought forth. Pharaoh had not been moved by them. Fifth, God had hardened his heart, as a judgment upon him, after he had first himself hardened it. The result had been a series of manifestations calculated to impress the Israelites with a sense of God's protecting care, the Egyptians, and the neighboring nations with a sense of his power to punish. Matthew Henry's concise commentary, chapter 11 verses 4 through 10, the death of all the firstborn in Egypt at once. This plague had been the first threatened, but his last executed. See how slow God is to wrath. The plague is foretold, the time is fixed, all their firstborn should sleep the sleep of death. Not silently, but so as to rouse the families at midnight. The prince was not too high to be reached by it, nor the slaves at the mill too low to be noticed. While angels slew the Egyptians, not so much as a dog should bark at any of the children of Israel. It is an earnest of the difference there shall be in the great day between God's people and his enemies. Did men know what a difference God puts, and will put to eternity, between those that serve him and those that serve him not? Religion would not seem to them an indifferent thing, nor would they act in it with so much carelessness as they do. When Moses had thus delivered his message, he went out from Pharaoh in great anger at his obstinacy, though he was the meekest of the men of the earth. The Scripture has foretold the unbelief of many who hear the gospel, that it might not be a surprise or stumbling block to us. Rome 10:16. Let us never think the worse of the gospel of Christ for the slights men put upon it. Pharaoh was hardened, yet he was compelled to abate his stern and haughty demands, till the Israelites got full freedom. In like manner the people of God will find that every struggle against their spiritual adversary, made in the might of Jesus Christ, every attempt to overcome him by the blood of the Lamb, and every desire to attain increasing likeness and love to that Lamb, will be rewarded by increasing freedom from the enemy of souls. The events in Exodus chapter 12 are significant for many different reasons and historic. What we see, among other things, is God giving the Israelites the Passover, and this signified their readiness for change. It represented day one of a new start of trusting in and following the Lord. Verse 2. 3 features of the Passover emphasized how they could prepare for that new life: a sacrifice, sandals, and a blood mark. For the Israelites, the coming deliverance from Egypt was such a significant act that God instructed them to remake their calendar. The new year would now start with the month of their redemption from Egypt, which was in. Illustrated everything was going to change. Charles Spurgeon wrote, "Commence a nation's annals from its evangelization. Begin the chronicle of a people from the day when they bow at the feet of Jesus." According to the customs of this day, on the 10th of this first month, each family or household was to take a lamb, and the lamb was to live with the family for the 4 days until Passover on the 10th day of this month, until the 14th day of the same month. These traditions and customs may not make sense to us today, but they were commonplace according to the traditions and customs of the day. Research shows the lamb became part of the family. By the time it was sacrificed on the 14th, it was both cherished and mourned. God wanted the sacrifice of something precious. The Passover was also a way to commemorate the Israelites' deliverance from slavery in Egypt, and instructions were given to smear the blood of a sacrificed lamb on their doorposts and lintels. This was a sign that God would pass over their homes and not kill their firstborn. The Passover meal is a family eating hurriedly while wearing sandals, girding their loins, and holding their staff, and it was to celebrate the feast of unleavened bread after removing all leaven from their homes. They were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days, beginning and ending with a communal feast, according to Jewish tradition. Exodus 12 verse 2 to be the first commandment given to the Israelites by God. And the verse clarifies that the first month is in the spring, not the autumn. Verse 3 sees God instructing the Israelites to choose a lamb or young goat for sacrifice on the 10th day of the month. This was part of God's instructions to Moses and Aaron for the first Passover. But God instructs the Israelites that if a household is too small to eat a whole lamb, they should share with their nearest neighbor. This communal commandment was intended to strengthen ties between families and neighbors. The requirements for the lamb to be sacrificed, including that it must be without imperfections, complete and whole. This symbolizes the sinless nature of Jesus Christ, the ultimate Passover lamb. The lamb could be chosen from either sheep or goats. The word translated sheep in verses 3-5 literally means one of a flock. These verses illustrate the importance of sacrifice and atonement, and the idea that deliverance comes through obedience to God. The Israelites were instructed to smear the blood of a lamb on their doorposts, lintels, and sides as a sign of obedience and faith in God. This may seem like a crazy thing to do, but the Israelites were demonstrating their trust in God's protection and believing that the divine judgment would pass over their homes. Further, the Israelites were showing their faith in God's promise. God gave the Israelites for their first Passover meal. The Israelites were commanded to eat the flesh of a sacrificed lamb, which represented the cost of deliverance. Unleavened bread symbolized the haste required during their exodus. Bitter herbs recall the suffering endured in slavery. Sandals and staff were instructed as they consumed the lamb. The sandals on and staff in hand, to underscore the urgency of their deliverance. God gave instructions for preparing and eating the Passover lamb. The instructions for roasting the lamb symbolize the importance of obedience and reverence in worship. The lamb was to be roasted whole, with the head, legs, and internal organs intact, to signify the completeness of the sacrifice and God's deliverance. Roasting the lamb instead of boiling or eating it raw set the Israelites apart from the Egyptians, who often practiced sacrificial traditions that involved boiling or eating raw meat. The lamb was to be placed on the table undivided, symbolizing the unity and fellowship between the Israelites and the Lord. Instructions were given to eat the meal quickly, emphasizing the urgency of not procrastinating. The first 10 verses emphasize the importance of obedience, holiness, and completeness in worship. The Passover meal had instructions attached to it, and how to eat, including eating the meal with a sense of urgency, with their loins girded, shoes on their feet, and staff in hand. We are getting closer to freedom for the Israelites, or Pharaoh finally living up to his word, as we witness the final plague from the 10 plagues upon Egypt. The 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. This included the firstborn children and animals. This event leads to Pharaoh allowing the Israelites to leave Egypt. Here, God declares his intention to execute the most severe of plagues, targeting the very heart of Egyptian society, its firstborn sons. There is going to be judgment against all the false gods of Egypt. And when God takes the firstborn sons, the blood will serve as a sign on the houses where you live. Instructions are given that this day be remembered and celebrated as a lasting ordinance, emphasizing its permanence within Israel's religious life. In the context of the Passover, the Israelites were directed to remove all leaven from their homes as a preparatory step. According to Earl Hinn of the Church of the Great God, Paul plainly instructs that the purpose of keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread is to remind us of our need to remove sin from our lives. Penny Noyes of Christianity.com explains, the annual Passover celebration is a symbolic reenactment of the Israelites' last night as slaves in Egypt. The Passover is a time of remembrance for God's people. God gave Moses specific instructions regarding the annual celebration of God's deliverance from their slavery in Egypt. In the Bible, whenever yeast is referenced, it's typically symbolizing sin. So during this celebration, the meal is eaten without the yeast, which is symbolic of removing sin from our lives. Verse 17 build on the Passover meal and the importance on remembrance. Ye shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Verse 18 was a way for the Israelites to remember and commemorate the miraculous events that led to their liberation. The instruction to abstain from eating leavened bread for 7 days directly reflects the urgency of Israel's impending exodus from Egypt. the law was very strict as to the Passover. And the Jews were so in their usages that no leaven should be found in their houses. Bible Study Tools explains of the reading, "For whoso eateth that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel," which is repeated to deter them from the breach of this ordinance. See Gill on Exodus 12 verse 15. And it is added for further explanation of whom it concerns, whether he be a stranger or born in the land by a stranger is meant, not a mere heathen, who was not bound by this law, but a proselyte. And not a proselyte of the gate, one that was only a sojourner among them, and observed the commandments of the sons of Noah, but a proselyte of righteousness, who professed the Jewish religion, and proposed to conform to it in all respects, and therefore was obliged to observe this as other precepts. And by one born in the land is intended a native of the land of Canaan, whither they were now going in order to possess it, or a real Israelite, such as were born of Israelitish parents, and proper inhabitants of Canaan, which they would be put into the possession of. Verse 20, the instruction to eat unleavened bread and avoid leavened products is a symbolic gesture that represents the Israelites' haste to leave Egypt. Moses instructs the elders of Israel to select a lamb for each of their families, and then to sacrifice it as part of the Passover observance. And the act of obediently sacrificing the lamb was a crucial part of the Israelites' protection and redemption from the plague. Verse 22 serves as a reminder of the importance of faith and obedience. Without question, much of this chapter, and so much of what Moses and Aaron were called to do in Exodus thus far have illustrated the importance of faith and obedience, further pointing towards the ultimate redemption and salvation provided through the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. The instruction to apply lamb's blood to the doorframe serves as a physical sign of their faith and obedience to God's command. This act is not just a ritual, but a profound expression of trust in God's promise to spare them from the impending judgment. The Israelites were reminded to observe it all, not just one occurrence or event he hold before observed relating to the feast of the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread, and all the rites appertaining to them, which were to be observed until the coming of Christ. The event was to be remembered even after they entered the land of God. After leaving Egypt, they are to continue to observe the Passover as a perpetual ordinance. The purpose is not merely to perform a ritual, as in doing something just to be doing something, but to instill a deeper understanding of the event's meaning. In a further act of worship, the sons of Israel went and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. Verse 29 is inching closer to the 10th plague. And here we a demonstration of the power and sovereignty of God, a pivotal moment of divine judgment and redemption, and a foreshadowing of the broader biblical narrative of deliverance and salvation. In the morning, when Pharaoh awoke, there was a great cry throughout Egypt, as every house of the Egyptians had at least one dead. According to Clark's commentary on verse 29, there was a great cry. No people in the universe were more remarkable for their mournings than the Egyptians, especially in matters of religion. They whipped, beat, tore themselves, and howled in all the excess of grief. When a relative died, the people left the house, ran into the streets, and howled in the most lamentable and frantic manner. We see throughout this chapter, and throughout the first 2 books of the Bible, just as Pharaoh and Egypt was beginning to understand the consequences of disobedience, the righteousness of divine judgment, and the symbolism of sacrifice and redemption. The ballgame has completely changed, and Pharaoh's pride has been broken by divine judgment. Following the devastating death of the firstborn in Egypt, Pharaoh not only acknowledges Moses, but urgently commands him to leave with the Israelites. It took 10 devastating plagues before Pharaoh got the bigger picture. But I do believe this happens to all of us from time to time. It may not take 10 plagues. But God has to do great things to us in our lives before we get the bigger picture. The Egyptians begin to understand, as they have living proof, and overcome with fear and desperation, urging the Israelites to leave the land without delay. According to the website Bible Art, verse 34 captures a pivotal moment in the history of the Israelites. As they obediently prepare to leave Egypt in haste, trusting in God's guidance and protection. The symbolism of unleavened bread and the careful preparations for departure underscore the urgency and spiritual readiness required for the journey ahead. This verse carries profound meanings of obedience, deliverance, and redemption, serving as a timeless reminder of the faithfulness and power of God in fulfilling His promises. Verse 35 symbolizes the Israelites' departure from Egypt and their newfound freedom, as well as God's faithfulness to His promises and His concern for justice. Apparently, the Israelites had gained favor from the people of Egypt as they were urged to leave, and we see this with Jacob way back in Genesis when his 2 sons, Simeon and Levi, destroyed the city of Shechem in retaliation of what had been done to their sister, Dinah. Jacob was worried about leaving as he feared retaliation. But God protected his family from such acts. Verse 37 features a turning point as the Israelites begin their journey out of Egypt. Apparently, verse 30 informs us that after the series of miracles that God performed in Egypt, many locals, Egyptians and others, decided to leave with the Israelites and joined them in their trek to worship the God of heaven and earth. Verse 39 refers to the haste with which the Israelites were commanded to leave Egypt. For example, the instructions from God were the Israelites were not allowed to wait for their bread to rise, so they baked unleavened bread as they fled. This symbolizes the Israelites' readiness to leave at a moment's notice, and their obedience to God's command. According to Clark's commentary, now the sojourning of the children of Israel. The statement in this verse is allowed on all hands to be extremely difficult, and therefore the passage stands in a special need of illustration. That the descendants of Israel did not dwell 430 years in Egypt, says Dr. Kennicott, may be easily proved, and has often been demonstrated. Some therefore imagine that by Egypt here both it and Canaan are to be understood. But this greater latitude of place will not solve the difficulty, since the Israelites, including Israel their father, did not sojourn 430 years in both countries previous to their departure from Egypt. Verse 41, after 430 years of captivity. The very day marks their liberation is of immense significance, symbolizing not just physical freedom, but the beginning of their journey as God's chosen people. This verse marks the precise moment when the Israelites were freed from Egypt after 430 years. The phrase "to the very day" emphasizes that God's timing is exact and intentional. Clark's commentary on verse 42, a night to be held in everlasting remembrance, because of the peculiar display of the power and goodness of God, the observance of which annually was to be considered a religious precept, while the Jewish nation should continue. God gives the instructions on how the Passover should take place, including who should eat and participate, and who should not. Bible Study Tools explains, the same time he acquainted them with the above things. This is the ordinance of the Passover as before delivered, and these the laws and rules, according to which it is to be observed, as now related, both with respect to the lamb and to the unleavened bread. And the following is an account of the persons that were to partake of it, there shall no stranger eat thereof, one that is of another country, an entire heathen, and unacquainted with, and does not profess the Jewish religion, which was the religion of God. For example, a slave who has been bought by an Israelite may partake in the Passover meal, but only after he has been circumcised. Verse 45 teaches us God emphasizes the exclusivity of His covenant community during the Passover. That is, the instructions highlight that only those who are circumcised, those committed to the covenant, may partake in the sacrificial meal. Verse 47 notes the instruction regarding the lamb's consumption emphasizes community and unity among the Israelites, as they were commanded to eat the Passover lamb in one house and not take any of the meat out. God commanded the Israelites to eat the Passover meal together in one house, emphasizing the communal aspect of the celebration. Christianity.com points out, from Matthew Henry's commentary, in times to come, all the congregation of Israel must keep the Passover. All that share in God's mercies should join in thankful praises for them. The New Testament Passover, the Lord's Supper, ought not to be neglected by any. Clark's commentary on verse 48, and when a stranger will keep the Passover, let all who sojourn among you, and who desire to partake of this sacred ordinance, not only be circumcised themselves, but all the males of their families likewise, that they may all have an equal right to the blessings of the covenant. Verse 49 illustrates the importance of treating others with fairness, compassion, and respect, regardless of their background or origin. This is a lesson for each of us today, regardless of where we are on earth, or where we are in our walks with Christ. Verse 50 emphasizes the importance of obedience to God's word. The Israelites' willingness to do exactly what the Lord commanded reflects their faith in God's promises and their recognition of His authority. We end with verse 51, which marks the culmination of the Israelites' journey towards liberation from Egypt. We see that the adherence to God's commands results in salvation and assurance amid judgment. We have reached the end of our Bible study today for Exodus chapter 12. We have experienced many firsts and historical events in the book of Genesis. And now, we are beginning a new history for the Israelite people, including the turning of Pharaoh against the Jewish people, the death order, and the arrival of Moses, and God's instructions for Moses to lead the Jewish people out of slavery. But Pharaoh will not be convinced so easily. The last several chapters have illustrated the significance and destruction of the plagues upon Egypt, and now we have arrived at the last plague and the Passover of the Israelites. There is no telling what the next studies will reveal, so join us next time for our Bible study here on Diggin Deeper, as we simply dig deeper into the Word of God. Before we go, if you liked what you just watched, like and share our content. It really helps us grow. And think about subscribing to our channel, which will help you keep up to date with all of our content. Once again, I am your host, Billy Ray Parrish, and until next time, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and God bless.